I wanted to talk a little bit about some spiritual topics and just kind of create a foundation for future videos I'm going to be posting. So, the first core concept is, what is spirituality? Like, what does it mean? And at least from my perspective, my personal experience, I guess you could say I've been on the path for since 2007, so maybe about 18 years or so. From my experience, there's really two aspects of ourself. You have your ego and then your true self. So the goal, generally speaking, is alignment with your true self. And the only way to get that alignment with your true self is to let go of identity with the ego self. So that's essentially the basic pathway to the ultimate goal, which would be self-realization. So when you're on the start of this spiritual path, you could look at it this way. You're 99% ego, 1% soul identity. And then when you hit self-realization, you're 100% soul identity, 0% ego identity. And there's a specific experience that happens at self-realization that is specific to the witness collapsing, or another way to put it, the ego collapsing, and then the full mergence into the self, which would be full identity of self or self-realization. Some call it enlightenment. Now in future videos I'll talk about how there is another paradigm beyond that, which I'm exploring currently, trying to. But that's not necessarily relevant. It's definitely not relevant for most people. The main goal for the soul, from my perspective, is self-realization or enlightenment. And there's really two aspects of it. I like to use the percentage component of like ego identity percentage versus soul identity percentage. So like the spiritual seeking stage, which is what most people are in, you're basically starting from like where you first learn about spirituality or open up to it. You basically realize that there's something bigger than yourself. That's where the spiritual journey starts. And really all it is you've just woken up to your soul, basically. You realize it's there. And not from a conceptual reality, but from a experiential reality, which is what spirituality is. Spirituality is experiential. There's nothing conceptual about it. In fact, that's what you're releasing. There is a process in terms of ego development that I'll also talk in later videos, in terms of how before you even get to spirituality, you need to have the ego peak, and then spirituality is when you start letting go of ego. But you do have to have the experience of peaking the ego first, because essentially you need to make sure that your happiness really isn't outside of you. And until you do that, you won't have the energy or the interest in going within, because there's so much pressure to look for our happiness outside of ourselves. So until you actually realize that there is no happiness outside of yourself, you're still going to be looking for, whether it's career success, partner, physical beauty, or whatever. You're going to be looking for that validation outside of yourself. And only when we're really ready do we start shifting that energy and then opening up to other possibilities. One of the interesting things about life or the universe is it waits for you to ask for it. Like, it doesn't impose itself on you. Your soul, your higher self, will never impose itself onto you. It will gently guide you into realizing itself, but it will never impose it. So anyway, most people are between that 1% and 50% ego identity. And then if you are able to get to that 50% soul identity, which is the process of just regular growth or continuous growth, now that would be considered, from my perspective at least, awakening. So this is where your I would call the seeking sense stops, and you move into this kind of non-duality realization. And there's a few teachers I really like how they talk about this, particularly Adyashanti, where after you have the initial awakening, that's not generally self-realization. Self-realization would be full embodied awakening. So the first awakening would be your higher self, or your experience of 51% soul identity. And when you have that 51% soul identity, your feeling of your sense of self becomes nonlinear. So it's very at this level, it's very disorienting, because now it almost feels like almost unstable, because now who you are identifying as is soul more than ego. Whereas even though the ego can feel very boxed in or very like restrictive, there's a sense of like security in just being rooted. Even if it doesn't really serve you, there's a certain rootedness that can be more comfortable. But as you move into the non-dual levels, it can be a bit uncomfortable, just because it's new. It's almost like you're a leaf floating in the wind. It's a little uncomfortable at first. It can be for a couple of years. For me, it was probably a year after having my first awakening experience, probably around 2017 or so, that I got used to the experience or the feeling. So but I will say this, after you have that first awakening, growth in general is easier because the ego isn't quite as fixed. So it's just not hanging on to physical reality as strongly. So shifting into deeper and deeper soul perspectives becomes a little bit easier. It's not easy, obviously, because anytime you grow, it's hard. Because growing and shifting ego identity is essentially moving toward your own death. Because anytime you're growing as an ego, you're going to feel like you're dying. It's true for everyone. That's why it's so rare for people to actually genuinely seek it. And I have a lot of respect for anyone even trying, because it's a lot easier, particularly in our society, to just stick with the norm, stick with what most people are doing. The goal then, really, if you're able to hit the non-dual levels, is just keep going, keep exploring, keep pushing yourself. Don't be afraid if it takes a while. It's okay if you don't know what's going to happen next. It's okay if you're unsure or scared. There are going to be ups and downs, because your ego is your sense of identity. So shifting it away from being tied to the body, there's nothing harder. I mean, it will be the hardest thing you ever do. And anyone watching this probably already has an experience of that. I always tell people I coach or work with that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. You don't have to be, there's really no way to get where you want fast, at least not from any conscious effort. Also, the non-dual, just to clarify the non-dual levels, and like I said before, Adyashanti, who I think has a really good description of this, he would call the awakening going from the head to the heart to the gut. And then when you awaken from the gut, that's where your tether to the body is released. And that's where I would call that self-realization. Some people call that like the witness collapsing, or just having a full experience of oneness. The only way to fully experience that is that gut fear you have has to be released. So yeah, this is just a general overview. I'll go into more specifics for each paradigm. Like I said, most people, there's some really interesting stuff with Don Juan in terms of the spiritual seeking paradigm. So between that 0 and 50% identity, he calls it fear, clarity, power, and that really resonated a lot with me. David Hawkins has a really interesting scale. He was a spiritual teacher for many years ago, where he had the scale of consciousness, where it goes to a 0 to 1,000, where 500 is the start of spirituality, and then 600 would be that first awakening level. I found his scale to be extremely accurate. I wouldn't recommend it for everybody, because it's very easy to get caught in the scale. just from an ego standpoint. But if you're able to stay relatively detached with it, it's extremely useful. So yeah, I'd say the goal, just as an overview, the goal is just keep working on moving from ego identity to soul identity. And the more you do that, life gets less resistant, more I wouldn't say simplistic, but it's more at ease. It flows easier. You're more in a state of relaxation, and really the only reason you're in a state of relaxation is you're just not in your mind as much. You're more in the center of yourself. So yeah, this kind of just an intro video. I'm just trying to get some of my spiritual thoughts out there. I hope some of it made sense, or at least some of interest. I'll try to post more. I do some coaching and spiritual teaching. I do love one-on-one sessions. But yeah, my name's Keith, and if you want to reach out, connect, you can message me or email me. All right, thanks for listening.